Reading the Bible for oneself inherently leads to people thinking for themselves. And that's what happened in Boston and the Massachusetts Bay Colony. If we look at post-1980's stand-up, we're essentially seeing self-taught sociologists up on stage. And there was a new generation of Boston comics, guys like Louis C.K., Patrice O'Neill, Bill Burr, Doug Stanhope, Gary Goldman. It was almost as if this new style was tailor-made for these guys. Puritans were in fact radical revolutionaries. They wanted everyone to read and analyze the Bible for themselves. So when they founded the Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1628, in no time, it had the highest literacy rate in the entire world. So why are so many good comedians from Boston? I'm going to answer that. But first, let's see what Joe Rogan had to say.
First joke in Boston is fucking clutch. You got to get up there and get a laugh fast.
Yeah. It's fucking cold there in the winter. It makes harder people.
Yeah, that's right.
It makes people that know how to get past that fucking hump.
Yeah.
That's a 3-month hump where it sucks.
It's an immigrant city too. You know, they had all the Italians and the Irish. They all came in and they fucking fought it out.
Yeah, and I think it was the magical ingredient for stand-up.
So I've heard Joe mention cold weather a few different times. And I think it's a decent theory, and there's likely even some truth to it. But it doesn't really explain why Boston produces more great comedians per capita than other cold cities like Chicago, Detroit, Philly, or Minneapolis. In truth, I think there are multiple factors at play here, but I'm going to talk about the most interesting one, and by far the least talked about one, which is Boston's Puritan beginnings. The Puritans were in fact radical revolutionaries of their times. What made them radical? Firstly, they wanted everyone to read and analyze the Bible for themselves. That might not seem revolutionary to you, but for the 1600s, it was revolutionary. Reading the Bible for oneself, rather than having a priest or bishop pick passages to recite to you, inherently leads to people thinking for themselves. And that's what happened in Boston and the Massachusetts Bay Colony. But let me show you just how radical the Puritans were. There was a sect of them in England called the Levelers, who called for equal rights for all men, regardless of class, and universal male suffrage. And a subsect of the Levelers, called the Diggers, called for communal ownership of farmland and complete economic equality within those communes. A lot of Levelers and Diggers became Quakers later on and pushed even further for egalitarian measures, including for women. So point being that Britain was in the midst of a radical revolution in the 1600s, far more radical than most people realize. And that radical revolutionary fervor came directly to the Massachusetts Bay Colony with the Puritan settlers. Taking it back to stand-up comedy, if we look at post-1980's stand-up, and it is important that we delineate between 80s and post-80s stand-up, we're essentially seeing self-taught sociologists up on stage. They pick apart and dissect weird little societal behaviors from angles we hadn't thought about before, with a level of honest, self-deprecating self-reflection that we really didn't see much of in the 80s. But 90s comics started pushing stand-up into a more cerebral, emotionally aware, long-form direction. Check out this clip of old schooler Jay Leno and new schooler Joe Rogan discussing punchline frequency.
And you can see the difference too. You can see the jokes come every 6 to 9 seconds versus every 30 seconds or some guy. Hey, y'all, good mood. How y'all doing? Yeah. Woo. I tell you, get to the joke.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's that old school attitude too. The people don't have a lot of attention. They they don't have much time for this.
Right.
Go.
So Joe was being polite, but he obviously disagreed with Leno on the need to deliver a punchline every 6 to 9 seconds. To reiterate this point, here's Joe and Louis C.K. commenting on 80s comic Richard Jenny.
Por favor, kiss your butt, buenos noches.
1980s comedy. So interesting.
Quick, rapid fire.
It just gets lonely on the road, boy.
And that right there is a major difference between the 80s style and the new style that began taking shape in the 90s. By the 2000s, the new style was beginning to dominate the entire comedy scene nationwide. And there was a new generation of Boston comics who managed to find their unique comedic voices within this new, more nuanced, sophisticated style. Guys like Louis C.K., Joe Rogan, Patrice O'Neal, Bill Burr, Doug Stanhope, Gary Gulman, and Mike Birbiglia. It was almost as if this new style was tailor-made for these guys. And really, if we think about the new style, and we think about what Boston is, it's obvious that it was a perfect fit for Boston itself. Boston is a city brimming with creative intelligence and intellectual curiosity. And it has a long history of revolutionary thinking, being at the forefront of innovation and societal change. It's all part of what makes Boston, Boston. And it was its radical Protestant revolutionary founders who infused Boston right from its outset with these cultural characteristics. The Puritans' conviction of having everyone read the Bible for themselves was a rebellious stance against the empire of the time, the Vatican, which had run Europe for centuries via Spain, Portugal, Venice, and other Catholic powerhouses. But the Puritans were also rebelling against the Anglican Church, England's official state church. They thought it was a completely watered-down version of Protestantism. Protestantism to the Puritans was a revolutionary movement to put the words of God directly into the hands of the people and to decentralize power both in church and in government. The Anglican Church held on to Catholicism's old hierarchical traditions, keeping power centralized and in the hands of the few. This really pissed off the Puritans and eventually led to them cutting off the king's head. Like I said, revolutionaries. But due to the dominance of the Catholic Church in Europe and the Anglican Church in Britain, the vast majority of Europeans and even most Brits weren't readers in the 17th century, weren't even literate. And the radical Protestants of England, Scotland, and Wales were hell-bent on changing that. So when they founded the Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1628, in no time, it had the highest literacy rate in the entire world. Higher than China and Japan, higher than Protestant Sweden and Netherlands, and double the literacy rate of England and its Anglican-ruled Virginia colony. Virginia maintained a ban on printing presses in their colony for an entire century after it was founded. Meanwhile, the Puritans brought a printing press to Harvard College in 1638, just 10 years after founding Massachusetts. They'd founded Harvard in 1636, of which Increase Mather, a well-known Boston clergyman, became president. His son, Cotton Mather, went on to found Yale College in the Connecticut colony in 1718. And it's really no coincidence at all that these two schools, often thought of as the nation's top two universities, were founded in Puritan colonies rather than in Southern Anglican colonies. Nor that the top school for engineering and sciences, MIT, was also founded in Boston. The Massachusetts Puritans embraced engineering and the sciences as much as they did theology. The Virginia colony, on the other hand, was actually founded 25 years before the Mass Bay colony, but it didn't create a university until 60 years after Harvard was established. In other words, it took them 100 years to create an institution of higher education in Virginia. And even then, it was a university set up by a royal British charter rather than the colonists taking the initiative to create one for themselves. That's how little they cared about education. And it's no coincidence either that North America's first public school was created in Boston rather than Virginia. And from the very beginning, that school was for kids of all socioeconomic backgrounds. This was in 1635, guys. 7 years later, Mass Bay mandated that all parents provide their kids with a basic education, and that any town of 50 households or more establish a grammar school, the old Delude or Satan law. Somehow all we get taught is the Scarlet Letter and the witch trials? The stark differences between Massachusetts Bay and Virginia are super interesting because they're a perfect microcosm for the differences between all future northern colonies and all future southern colonies. Essentially, almost all the northern colonies were founded by radical Protestants, and all the southern colonies by royalist Anglicans. Well, to be fair, Georgia was initially founded as an anti-slavery refuge for debt prisoners. But wealthy Anglican landowners took control of it within 20 years and made it a proper southern slavery-loving royalist colony. Now, the Virginia colony was settled by the Virginia Company, with its express purpose of making money off exporting natural resources back to Europe. It was literally just an appendage of the crown. Virginia's ruling class was majority Anglican. Like I said earlier, the official state religion of the British Crown. So there was absolutely nothing revolutionary about its founders. Virginia's infrastructure and industry went on to develop at a snail's pace compared to Massachusetts. And to this day, Virginia is a state of strip malls and cookie-cutter housing developments that underfunds its public education. A society based off raw resource extraction is one in which its rich profit and its poor stay uneducated. Essentially, Virginia's ruling class was shallow-minded and materialistic, whereas the Puritans were driven by deep-felt principles and a yearning to change society for the betterment of all human beings. This contrast between Massachusetts and Virginia's founders helps to explain why there seems to exist some sort of a heightened intellectual curiosity, or maybe even a heightened creative intelligence in Boston as compared to the rest of the country. And I think it's a significant factor contributing to why Boston has produced so many talented comedians when compared to the former Southern colonies: Georgia, the Carolinas, Virginia, and Florida. But why haven't the former Northern colonies produced nationally recognized stand-ups at the same clip as Massachusetts? Simple. Massachusetts had the head start. They were the first radical Protestant colony in North America. The Puritans gave Boston a huge head start over the rest of the country on everything from industry and infrastructure to technology and the sciences to public and higher education. That's why you have like a zillion universities in Boston. So the point of all this is to show that the ideological makeup of the founders of each of America's regions had far more influence on the culture of those localities than we tend to give credence to today. And by founders, I mean the families of high status, those who had influence over the laws, business practices, hiring and firing of workers, etc. They, by and large, set the cultural tone of each colony. Or immigrants who came later on may have tweaked the culture, but more than anything, they had to find a way to fit in to the already prevalent culture as a matter of mere survival. The American melting pot mentality. Immigrant kids in the 1950s would play baseball and basketball to fit in. Families Americanized their last names and adapted to American clothing fashions. It was the same in the 1920s, same in the 1800s, and the same in the 1700s. For example, Boston being a town of hardworking people.
And there's like an ethic in the town. Like they appreciate hard work. Like all my friends growing up, like a lot of them that I'm still friends with today, they're tradesmen. You know, one of my buddies is an electrician, the other one's a carpenter, and I still talk to them to this day. They always were hard workers. When I was in high school, they were busting their ass. They would work for their dad, or they worked for an uncle. They would, take side jobs after school. There was like everybody was always going for it.
That work ethic is largely due to the Puritans. In the 17th century, only Protestants considered work time sacred. The Catholic Church did not consider work time sacred. And the Anglican Southerners, generally just being a go-along, get-along bunch, really only half believed in the ideals of the Reformation. Meaning that the only colonies where work time would have truly been considered sacred time would have been those in the North, founded by radical Protestants. First and foremost, the Massachusetts Bay Colony. So this all begs the question, why have we been presented with this extremely narrow image of the Puritans as conservative and dull, rather than progress-seeking, forward-thinking, radical revolutionaries? Maybe are we now the citizens of a stagnating empire, being presented with hand-picked passages of history? Food for thought. Subscribe, like, comment, and share this with anyone you know who might be interested.